It was supposed to be the easiest regime change in history. No military invasion, no CIA coup, just diplomatic recognition. The United States and 50 other countries would simply declare Nicolás Maduro illegitimate and recognize Juan Guaidó as president instead. Maduro, isolated and friendless, would have no choice but to leave. That was the plan on January 23, 2019. By January 2020, exactly 1 year later, here's what had happened. Maduro was still president, still in the palace, still in power. Guaidó was still calling himself president, but he wasn't governing anything. He couldn't enter most government buildings. His cabinet met in secret locations. His presidency existed only on paper and in foreign capitals. The international community that had recognized him was quietly backing away, embarrassed. And Maduro? Maduro was on television, laughing. What went wrong? How did the most powerful diplomatic coalition since the Iraq War fail to remove a dictator who had no popular support, no economic success, and no international legitimacy? The answer lies in what happened during the first 72 hours after Trump's announcement. In those 3 days, Maduro made a series of brutal decisions that proved he understood something fundamental about power that the entire Western world had forgotten. This is the story of the greatest diplomatic failure of the 21st century, and why Nicolás Maduro is still in power today. To understand how this happened, you need to understand where Venezuela was in January 2019. The country was in complete collapse. Hyperinflation had reached 1,000,000%. Store shelves were empty. Hospitals had no medicine. People were fleeing by the thousands every day, creating the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history. Over 4 million Venezuelans had already left the country, and it was all Maduro's fault. He'd taken power in 2013 after Hugo Chávez's death and immediately drove the economy into the ground. He printed money to cover budget deficits, causing the currency to become worthless. He imposed price controls that led to shortages. He nationalized businesses, scaring away investment. By 2019, Venezuela's GDP had contracted by more than 50%. It was economic devastation on a scale not seen outside of war zones. Maduro's approval rating was in the teens. The military was getting restless. International pressure was mounting. The Trump administration had imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry. Russia and China, Venezuela's main backers, were getting tired of throwing money into what looked like a sinking ship. This was the moment the opposition had been waiting for. And they had a plan. Juan Guaidó was not a household name in Venezuela. He was 35 years old, an industrial engineer by training, and had been elected to the National Assembly in 2015. The National Assembly was the only branch of government the opposition still controlled, though Maduro had stripped it of most of its powers. In January 2019, Guaidó had been elected president of the Assembly, a largely ceremonial position that rotated among opposition parties. But Guaidó and his advisors saw an opening. Article 233 of Venezuela's constitution stated that if the presidency was vacant, the president of the National Assembly would assume interim executive powers until new elections could be held. The opposition's argument was simple. Maduro's 2018 re-election had been fraudulent, with most opposition candidates banned from running and international observers refusing to legitimize the process. Therefore, the presidency was technically vacant. Therefore, Guaidó was the constitutional president. It was a legal stretch, but it was the best shot they had. The question was whether the international community would buy it. On January 21, 2019, Guaidó tested the waters. He gave a speech at a protest in Caracas, declaring Maduro a usurper and announcing that he was prepared to assume the presidency under Article 233. The crowd cheered, the opposition rallied, but everyone expected it to go nowhere. These kinds of symbolic gestures had been tried before and they never worked. But this time, something was different. Behind the scenes, Guaidó's team had been in contact with the Trump administration. And Trump was looking for a win in Latin America. He'd spent the past 2 years being criticized for his policies on everything from immigration to trade. Venezuela was a chance to look like a champion of democracy without putting boots on the ground. On January 23, 2019, 2 days after Guaidó's speech, Trump made his move. It was 11:47 a.m. when Trump walked into the Rose Garden and stood behind the presidential podium. The statement was brief, direct, and unprecedented. The citizens of Venezuela have courageously spoken out against Maduro and his regime and demanded freedom and the rule of law. I will always stand with the people in their noble quest for freedom. The United States recognizes Juan Guaidó as the legitimate interim president of Venezuela. Those words changed everything. Within minutes, the president of the Organization of American States tweeted his support for Guaidó. Within an hour, Canada had recognized him. By the end of the day, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Paraguay had all followed suit. Over the next week, the number would grow to more than 50 countries, including the UK, France, Germany, and Spain. It was a diplomatic blitzkrieg. The message was clear. The international community had decided Maduro was done. Guaidó was the president now, whether Maduro liked it or not. In Caracas, Guaidó's supporters poured into the streets. Hundreds of thousands of people celebrated, waving flags, chanting, believing that finally, after years of suffering, change was coming. Guaidó himself appeared at the protests, flanked by supporters, declaring that today marks the beginning of the end, of the usurpation. International media went into overdrive. CNN ran the headline, "The beginning of the end for Maduro." The Washington Post called it a new dawn for Venezuela. The New York Times wrote that Maduro's hold on power appears increasingly tenuous. Experts appeared on television predicting that Maduro would be gone within weeks, maybe days. The thinking was simple. Maduro's regime survived on international recognition and economic support. Cut off that support, and the whole thing would collapse. The military would defect. The government would fracture. Maduro, faced with the choice between exile and prison, would choose exile. There was just one problem with this theory. Nobody had asked Maduro what he thought about it. When Maduro's aide burst into his office that morning with the news about Trump's announcement, Maduro's first reaction wasn't panic. It was curiosity. He asked his aide a series of simple questions. Do I still control the presidential palace? Yes. Do I still control the military? Yes. Do I still control the intelligence services? Yes. Do I still control the courts? Yes. Do I still control the state oil company? Yes. Then what exactly had changed? Maduro understood something that Trump and the 50 countries recognizing Guaidó had forgotten. Power doesn't come from recognition. Power comes from control. You can call someone president all you want, but if they can't command the military, if they can't enforce laws, if they can't occupy government buildings, then they're not actually president. They're just someone with a title. Within hours of Trump's announcement, Maduro gave the order, round them up. The first 72 hours after Trump's recognition of Guaidó were critical. This was the window where the coup could either succeed or fail. If the military defected to Guaidó, if government ministers resigned, if the state apparatus collapsed, then Maduro would be finished. He knew this. So did his inner circle. The next 3 days would determine everything. Maduro's response was swift and brutal. On the evening of January 23rd, just hours after Trump's announcement, SEBIN, Venezuela's intelligence service, began a wave of arrests. Opposition activists who'd been organizing protests were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Journalists who'd been covering Guaidó's speeches disappeared. Human rights lawyers found themselves in detention centers without charges. By January 24th, more than 40 people had been arrested. By January 25th, that number had doubled, but the arrests weren't random. They were surgical. Maduro wasn't going after Guaidó himself, not yet. That would create a martyr and might trigger a stronger international response. Instead, he went after the infrastructure, the organizers, the logistics people, the ones who arranged transportation for protests, the ones who printed flyers, the ones who connected opposition cells across the country. Without them, Guaidó might have the title, but he couldn't mobilize mass action. At the same time, Maduro moved to secure the military. This was the critical piece. If the generals defected, it was over. Maduro knew this better than anyone, so he gave them an offer they couldn't refuse. On January 24th, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez appeared on television flanked by the entire military high command. One by one, they declared their loyalty to Maduro. But this wasn't just theater. Behind the scenes, Maduro had made concrete promises. The generals were given control over lucrative sectors of the economy: oil, mining, food distribution. They were guaranteed protection from prosecution for any crimes committed during the regime. Their families were protected. Their wealth was protected. But more than that, Maduro made it clear what would happen if they defected. He had files on all of them, evidence of corruption, drug trafficking, human rights abuses. If they turned on him, those files would be released. They would face prosecution not just in Venezuela, but internationally. The U.S. had already indicted several Venezuelan officials on narco-terrorism charges. Defecting to Guaidó wouldn't save them. It would just make them vulnerable. The message was simple: stick with me and you stay rich and free. Betray me and you lose everything. The generals chose to stay. By January 26, 3 days after Trump's announcement, Maduro held a massive rally in Caracas. Government workers were bussed in, state employees were required to attend or face firing. Colectivos, armed pro-government militias, provided security. The crowd was large, carefully staged, but the message was clear. Maduro still commanded loyalty. He still had support, and he wasn't going anywhere. Maduro stood on the stage and mocked Trump. "They think they can impose a president on Venezuela with a tweet," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Venezuela is not a colony. We decide who our president is, not Washington." The crowd roared. Venezuelan state television played the footage on loop. Meanwhile, Guaidó was discovering the harsh reality of his situation. He could call himself president all he wanted. 50 countries could recognize him, but he couldn't enter most government buildings. When he tried to access the central bank to control Venezuela's foreign reserves, security forces blocked him. When he attempted to take command of the oil company PDVSA, his appointees were arrested. When he tried to deliver humanitarian aid from Colombia, Maduro closed the border and burned the aid trucks on camera. Guaidó's presidency existed in speeches and press conferences. Maduro's presidency existed in reality. The international community tried to apply pressure. The U.S. tightened sanctions. The European Union threatened more consequences. The Lima group of Latin American countries demanded Maduro step down. But Maduro had something they didn't expect: patience and powerful friends. Russia made it clear that it would veto any UN Security Council action against Venezuela. China continued to provide economic support through oil-for-loan deals. Cuba sent intelligence advisors and security personnel. Iran shipped gasoline when Venezuela's own refineries collapsed. Turkey provided a channel for gold sales to evade sanctions. These countries had their own reasons for keeping Maduro in power: geopolitical leverage against the U.S., debt repayment, ideological solidarity, and they weren't about to let Trump's recognition of Guaidó change their calculations. As weeks turned into months, the Guaidó experiment began to unravel. The military never defected. The mass protests that were supposed to bring down the regime fizzled out as people realized nothing was changing. Maduro remained in control of all the institutions that actually mattered: the guns, the courts, the oil, the security services. Guaidó tried everything. He called for uprisings. He attempted to win over military commanders. He organized a dramatic attempt to cross the Colombian border with humanitarian aid in February 2019, which ended in chaos when Maduro's forces fired on protesters. In April, he stood on a Caracas overpass with a handful of soldiers who'd supposedly defected and announced Operation Freedom, calling on the military to overthrow Maduro. Only 25 soldiers showed up. The uprising collapsed within hours. With each failed attempt, Guaidó's credibility diminished. The international community that had rushed to recognize him started to quietly distance themselves. Spain's foreign minister admitted that recognizing Guaidó hasn't worked. EU officials began discussing a negotiated solution. Even some in the Trump administration started to question the strategy. By January 2020, exactly 1 year after Trump's Rose Garden announcement, the situation was clear. Maduro was still in the presidential palace. He still controlled the government. He still commanded the military. Guaidó was still calling himself president, but his support had dwindled. His cabinet met in secret locations or via video conference. His international backers were losing interest. He'd become a president in name only, a symbolic figurehead with no actual power. The humanitarian crisis in Venezuela continued to worsen. More than 5 million people had now fled the country. Inflation was still astronomical. Food and medicine were still scarce. The economy continued to collapse. But Maduro remained. He'd survived what was supposed to be the easiest regime change in history. So, what went wrong? How did the most coordinated international effort since the Iraq War fail to remove a dictator who had no popular support, no economic success, and no democratic legitimacy? The answer is that the strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works in the 21st century. The Trump administration and its allies believed that international recognition mattered, that diplomatic isolation would force Maduro out, that a united front of democracies could simply declare a new president into existence. But Maduro understood something they didn't. In the modern world, especially in countries with weak institutions and strong security forces, legitimacy is a luxury. Control is what matters. As long as he controlled the military, the intelligence services, and the state apparatus, he could survive any amount of diplomatic pressure. Maduro also understood something about geopolitics that the Trump administration ignored. In a multipolar world, Western recognition is not universal recognition. Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and others were perfectly happy to keep doing business with Maduro, both as a way to counter U.S. influence and to protect their own interests in Venezuela. The international community wasn't actually united, it was split, and as long as Maduro had powerful backers willing to support him, diplomatic isolation was a myth. Finally, Maduro had learned from history. He'd watched what happened to Gaddafi in Libya, who gave up his weapons and was then overthrown. He'd watched what happened to Saddam Hussein, who lost international support and was invaded. He'd watched what happened to Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, who fled when the military turned on him. Maduro had learned the lesson: never give up power voluntarily, never trust international guarantees, and above all, keep the military loyal at any cost. The Guaidó experiment exposed the limits of U.S. power in the 21st century. America could recognize whoever it wanted as president. It could impose sanctions. It could organize international coalitions. But it couldn't actually remove a determined dictator who controlled the guns and had powerful allies willing to back him. Without military intervention, which Trump wasn't willing to do, all the recognition in the world was meaningless. By 2021, even the Biden administration had tacitly acknowledged the failure. While they didn't formally withdraw recognition of Guaidó, they started pursuing direct negotiations with Maduro's government. The facade of the interim president was quietly dropped. Guaidó's term as assembly president expired, and without new elections, his claim to the presidency became even more tenuous. He faded from headlines, a symbolic figure whose moment had passed. In December 2022, the opposition officially dissolved the interim government. Guaidó's presidency was over. It had accomplished nothing except to demonstrate that you cannot tweet a dictator out of power. Maduro, meanwhile, remained exactly where he'd been all along, in the presidential palace, controlling the military, surviving sanctions, diplomatic isolation, economic collapse, and mass emigration. He'd outlasted Trump. He'd outlasted Guaidó. He'd outlasted the predictions of every expert who said he'd be gone within weeks. The story of Trump's recognition of Guaidó is often told as a story about Venezuela. But it's really a story about power and about the gap between how we think the world works and how it actually works. 50 countries can recognize you as president. The UN can issue statements. The media can write articles predicting your opponent's downfall. But none of that matters if you don't control the institutions that enforce power. Nicolás Maduro learned that lesson long before January 23, 2019. Trump learned it the hard way, and Guaidó learned it too late. If this story revealed how modern authoritarianism actually survives, hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who thinks international pressure alone can bring down dictators. Drop a comment about what you think the U.S. and its allies should have done differently. And ring that notification bell for more untold stories about power, politics, and why reality rarely matches the headlines. Because understanding how Maduro survived isn't just about Venezuela. It's about understanding the future of global politics.